Okay, so I think that this pair of questions is kind of tricky, but we're going to get some help here. So if you're struggling with a science passage, you're struggling with some line references, remember you've got different SAT-specific ways that you can make some smart guesses. So in this case, I notice something about question 29. I notice that those line references are all over the place, right? There's some at the beginning, the very beginning of the passage, 12 to 13, and then 51 to 53 is kind of pretty close to the end. So that's where I might think, well, can the chronology rule help me here? Right? Because remember, the questions are supposed to be in the order in which they appear in the passage. So the answers to the questions are supposed to generally be in order. Now, there are exceptions occasionally, but all things being equal, I bet on the rule working. Now, the next question in this passage is a figure question, so that doesn't help us with a line reference. But question 27 was a pretty standard vocab question where we were told to look at line 42. So, if I were a betting man, I would say that for this question, the answer is probably after 42. Maybe it is 42, so maybe choice C is right, but honestly, I would not be confident that A and B are going to be that helpful here. They're probably wrong. Now, I still need to look at those choices. I still need to go through the whole process here, but if I were stuck and I had to choose between C and D or A and B, I'd be choosing C and D because they follow this other rule, and I trust the rule. And that is sometimes as good as we can do on a hard question, and that's okay. I'm giving you permission to use that. It's better to just, if you're stuck, guess something according to these rules and move on to other questions where you can get the points. You don't want to run out of time because of something stupid like this, especially if guessing would have gotten you those points anyway. So let's take a look. Let's see how we're going to navigate all this tough science in this passage. Start with question 28, right? We need to follow the QLC method, which means we need to go in order so that we don't get confused with all this stuff going around. So the Q stands for the question. Let's read the question. Based on the passage, which choice best describes the relationship between salt behavior in the nano world and in the macro world? So nano world, macro world, and salt. So if choices seem to be talking about that, that's a good sign. So let's go through it. 12 to 13. So that's right here. 12 to 13 is this. It says, maybe they are more common than we think. They are what? We think nanowires are special and go to great lengths to make them, says study co-author, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they're more common than they think. So I guess it's about the nanowires. So that's about, what's what part of the question is about, right? The nano world. I don't see anything about the macro world. And I actually don't even see anything about the behavior. So maybe that's another piece that I should be checking for. So this does not seem to be doing what it's supposed to do. So that's a bad sign. Let's cross out the green here. 22 to 24. That's down here. There. It plays no role, he says. Surface tension and electrostatic forces are much more important at this scale. Okay, scale, macro world, nano world. So what scale are we talking about? They're talking about the nano world, right? So notice what I've done for both choices A and B. I've read outside of the line reference. That's unusual. Normally I wouldn't do that for these kinds of questions. The +1 sentence rule, where we're supposed to read extra on either side, that only applies when the question has a line reference. When it's the choices, usually I just stick to the choices. The evidence is supposed to be in the choice. But in both these cases, there were words I was unsure about, right? Pronouns, mysteries that if I had just read back a little bit, I'd understand what they were saying. In this case, this scale is referring to some scale. I'd like to know what it is. It's talking about the nano world. It seems to be talking about the behavior. But it doesn't seem to be talking about the macro world at all. So it's missing something. So I might notice that and note that. Maybe this is what I have to pick because it does check some boxes, but it doesn't hit the big picture, the macro world here. So that's not great. Let's look at 39 to 42. Here. Starts here, and it's going to go down to the other piece. The initial attraction between the tip and salt might be due to electrostatic forces, perhaps good old van der Waals interactions. The researchers speculate. And, okay, So it's talking about a microscope tip. We've seen this for another question. I don't see anything about the macro world. I mean, I guess maybe the attraction is a behavior. So this doesn't stand out as being obviously wrong, but it also doesn't stand out as being obviously right. It happens. Hopefully D gives us something better, 51 to 53. So that's right here. Huge underground deposits of salt can bend like plastic, but water is believed to play a role at these scales. Well, okay. Huge underground deposits sounds pretty macro to me, right? Big picture, lots of salt. And then again, these scales. We're referring to a different scale. What scale are we talking about? Well, if we go back, it says the bizarre behavior, so again, there's behavior, we're checking boxes, is actually mirrored in the macro world. So this whole time in this passage, they've been talking about the nano world. And I've gotten that actually from the other line references that I've had to read. They're talking about like microscope tips, and they're talking about little salt nanowires. They're talking about small stuff. This is the first time I've seen them talk about big picture stuff too. And they're trying to make some sort of comparison between the big and the small. At this point, I don't really understand that comparison, but I see that both of those pieces are there. So I'd be pretty confident in D. Now, if I look at the choices in number 28 and something changes, then I might need to change my mind. But right now, this one is checking a bunch of boxes off. It's talking about the nano world, it's talking about the macro world, it's talking about the behavior, it's talking about the salt, and this is what gives me the most reassurance, it also follows the chronology rule. It matches my expectations for where the answer would be. That's a good sign. It probably means it's right because it's got a lot going for it. Now I go back to the choices in number 28, the C part of the QLC method, and I try to match that idea. Is there something in these choices that is matched in that line reference? So choice A says, in both the nano world and the macro world, salt can be flexible. So do they mention salt being flexible? Let's go here. So bizarre behavior. I don't know what the bizarre behavior is, but let's look at the underground. Huge underground deposits of salt can bend like plastic. Sounds pretty flexible. And if I go back, because it does say, here, let me use a different color here, this bizarre behavior, this is another case where I have kind of a vague reference to something that's come before it. And I normally wouldn't read too much extra, but that reference is clearly to something important that might help me understand what I'm reading. So what is the bizarre behavior? Well, it pulls away from the salt stretches. Stretching is flexibility. So that looks pretty good. This idea of flexibility seems to be in both the small scale and the big scale. Let's look at B. Salt flexibility is expected in the nano world, but is surprising in the macro world. Well, it says pretty much the exact same thing as A, but it adds a piece. And what we like is we like choices that are very vague and very simple. We don't like choices that have complexity because it means that there's more that could be wrong. What is this adding? It's adding like what the scientists thought was going to happen. And if we go to that line, they don't say it. They don't say that they were surprised. I would need evidence of that. Maybe it's surprising. I don't know enough about salt or whatever to know. But it's not for me to know. The lines have to know for me, and they need to tell me that, and I don't see it. I see it's a bizarre behavior, but I don't really get much more detail about whether or not it's surprising or expected in the macro world at all. So these are strong words that are causing problems for me. Basically, B says the same thing as A, but it adds on. And the add-on is bad. It's not provable. C. Salt nanowires were initially observed in the nano world and later observed in the macro world. Well, I don't think so. I think it seems the other way around, that they're just discovering the way it works in the nano world. But more important, the lines don't talk about order. They don't really get into first this happened and then this happened. So this idea of events in a row is not part of the lines. And finally, D, in the nano world, salt's interaction with water salt's interactions with water lead to very different properties than they do in the macro world. Well, no, this is saying the exact opposite thing as A. Right? A is saying that they're similar. D is saying that they're different. But the lines are saying that they're similar. It's making a comparison. They're using the word, where is it? Mirrored. Mirror means the same. So in both the nano world and the macro world, salt can be flexible. In the nano world, salt's interactions with water lead to very different properties. That's the opposite of what they're saying. So there we go. It matches A and D. So I think this is hard because there's a lot of extra reading I have to do for just one pair of questions. That's unusual. Normally when we have these line references, we're allowed to just stick to the line references. But if there are things that are mentioned outside of the line reference, you can read a little extra. The no reading strategy always lets you read extra if you need to. But I do think that I got a little bit of a boost on this question from the chronology rule. The fact that that line reference fits with what my expectations are, it made me more confident in it. It gave me a better sense of what I was looking at so that when I went through the choices in number 28, I was a little bit more focused on the right line reference. So we can use these little things. It adds up over time. That you get these little boosts. It saves a little bit of the time. It saves a little bit of mental energy. And so we want to use them to supplement what we're already doing. The chronology rule is not a replacement for actually reading and understanding as much as we can, but it is a boost. It helps us. And in this case, I absolutely think it helped me get both of these questions right.